There was a time when Alan Krauss believed his most dangerous days were behind him. A former military man, accustomed to state secrets and impossible missions, now lived a peaceful routine as a security consultant. However, a phone call on a freezing night changed everything. An old debt to the government, something he swore never to revisit, dragged him back to the center of the mystery. "We need you in Antarctica!" The voice on the other end was impersonal, almost cold. The place where secrets never died and stories that were never meant to be told waited to be revealed. A secret base, buried in ice for more than 70 years, had been discovered. What little information he received was vague, but one thing was clear. The dark past of World War II was not as buried as everyone believed. "Alan, you are the only one who can understand what we will find there." The phrase echoed in his mind, an irresistible invitation into the unknown, as if the base itself was calling to him. He knew he should refuse. I knew there were things that ice was supposed to keep frozen forever, but the voice in the back of his mind, that instinct he couldn't silence, told him that this could be the key to something much bigger, something the world wasn't ready to discover. And so, without knowing exactly what awaited him, Alan Krauss embarked on a journey that promised no answers, just more questions. What was hidden in the ice? Who was willing to risk so much to keep the secret buried? And why, after so many years, had the government finally decided to dig so deep into oblivion? The door to the unknown had been opened, and an icy shadow was beginning to crawl out of it. Antarctica was a place where time seemed to stand still, a vast white desert that swallowed up any sign of life or progress. Alan's military plane cut through the gray sky, moving like a ghost over the continent. The forward base was just a few kilometers from the location where the buried structure had been found. Alan stared out the window, his heart racing as the relentless ice lay beneath him, immaculate, as if the planet itself were guarding an ancient secret. When the plane landed, he was greeted by Commander Thompson, a man of few words, and with the serious expression of someone who had seen things he would prefer to forget. "We are 2 days away from the excavation point. The structure is still partially covered by ice, but what we can already see is disturbing." Throughout the sled journey, the biting wind and extreme cold forced Alan to focus solely on staying warm. However, as they approached the location, a strange silence took over the landscape. Even the sound of the wind seemed to disappear, as if the ice around the base knew something must not be disturbed. When they finally arrived at the location, Alan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Before him was a gigantic opening in the ice, revealing part of a structure that shouldn't exist. Prefabricated military buildings, old equipment and vehicles still partially buried. Like a city frozen in time, it was a Nazi base. There was no doubt about it. But the question that was going through Alan's mind was, what was a military base of that magnitude doing in the most inhospitable place on Earth? The first excavation teams had found more than they bargained for. Frozen bodies of Nazi soldiers, preserved as if time had stopped the moment their hearts stopped beating. Alan felt the weight of mystery growing around him. Each step he took on the ice seemed heavier than the last. As the excavations progressed, bits of information began to emerge. Nazi flags, old maps, and what appeared to be a tunnel system extending beneath the base. There was something deeper there, something that not even the hardest ice could hide forever, but what exactly? That question seemed to envelope the air, as if the base itself was whispering ancient secrets that no one should hear. The first days at the base were tense. The excavation team, made up of scientists, soldiers, and technicians, was at its limit. The initial findings were already disturbing, but there was something that wasn't in the official reports. Alan could see the same expression in the eyes of each team member. Fear. The kind of fear that wasn't just the result of a hostile location. It was a deeper, primal fear that gripped people when they knew they were approaching something they shouldn't. The base itself was a maze of narrow corridors and abandoned rooms, all covered in a thin layer of ice and dust. The energy seemed to flow and disappear without warning. The lights flickered, and the generators failed frequently, as if the place itself was fighting against their presence. The wind outside sounded like distant moans, echoing through the tunnels that ran deep beneath the base. On the third night, something happened. One of the team's soldiers, Davis, disappeared during routine patrol. They found his radio lying on the ground, covered in a light layer of snow, but no sign of him. Intense searches were carried out, but Davis appeared to have dropped off the face of the earth. However, when Alan reviewed the security camera recordings, what he saw left him even more disturbed. Davis had walked towards one of the unexplored chambers, and suddenly stopped. He stood there motionless, as if he were listening to something, or someone. Then he simply turned and disappeared from the camera. Later that night, Alan began to hallucinate. Sounds that shouldn't be there, voices whispering your name. He tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to deny that there was a presence in this place, something ancient and malevolent, a shadow that crept through the base's corridors, watching, waiting. With Davis's disappearance and growing tension among the team, Alan began to realize that they were not alone on that base. Something was there, buried along with the secrets of the past, something ice couldn't hold forever. With Davis gone, fear among the team began to spread like a silent infection. What at first seemed like just the misfortune of a stray soldier soon took on a more sinister tone. Alan knew he couldn't lose control of the situation. He organized a detailed search of the base's unexplored tunnels, and it was there that everything began to unfold in even more disturbing ways. The underground tunnels extended far further than anyone imagined. There was a network of passages hidden beneath the base, like arteries carved out of ice, some bearing the marks of ancient civilization, and others filled with equipment and artifacts from the Nazi period. The hallways were long, cold, and oppressive, lit only by the staff's flickering flashlights, and it was in one of these corridors that they made their first major discovery. Behind a rusty metal door, which seemed to have been sealed for decades, was a huge room. Lined with files, boxes, and old machines, the smell of mold and decay filled the air. The room was a kind of archive, a repository of forgotten secrets. Alan, with his vast experience in military investigations, immediately realized the importance of what they had in hand. Among the yellowed, brittle documents were scientific reports detailing human experiments conducted during World War II, specifically on prisoners. The name Project Valkyrie appeared frequently in the records, accompanied by descriptions of brutal genetic manipulation procedures. The goal? Create a new breed of superior soldiers by manipulating human DNA with animal genes in a desperate attempt by the Nazis to change the course of the war. Most unsettlingly, alongside the reports, the team found old photographs of mutilated and deformed bodies, all frozen in time, preserved for decades in the unforgiving ice of Antarctica. There were images of men, women, and even children being subjected to experiments that defy human understanding. Among the piles of papers, they also discovered a tape recording with what appeared to be the testimonies of scientists at the time, reporting the partial success of the experiments. The archive room contained the first piece of the puzzle, but the scariest thing was the certainty that this was just the beginning. What else did the base hide in its deep, icy tunnels? Days passed after the files were discovered, but the atmosphere at the base only worsened. There was a growing feeling that something unseen was watching them. Alan, still processing the nature of the experiments described in the documents, knew that something even more disturbing waited deep within the structure. The tunnels had not yet been fully explored, and it was on one of these expeditions that the team found the hidden library. The entrance to the library was barely noticeable. Hidden behind a false wall of concrete and steel, after hours of digging, they finally gained access. When the lights of the lanterns illuminated the interior of the room, what they saw left everyone stunned. It was a gigantic room, full of metal shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, covered in folders, notebooks, documents, and strange glass cylinders that contained biological samples. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the air was saturated with the weight of decades of buried secrets. The shelves were organized with military precision, and each document there seemed to contain even darker details about what really happened in that place. Alan led the careful inspection of the site, and it was there that they found the most disturbing records of Project Valkyrie. The files revealed that Nazi scientists had managed to advance genetic fusion experiments. They tried to incorporate genes from different animals into human soldiers. Among the more grotesque examples were attempts to implant genes from salamanders, bats, and bears into test subjects, in the hope that these genes would give them abilities such as regeneration, immunity to disease, and hibernation. However, what shocked the team most were the reports of a soldier identified as Cain 1, a subject who had survived all the experiments, developing superhuman abilities, including an unparalleled regenerative capacity, and, according to some reports, powers. Telekinetics. Scientists at the time in their reports showed a mix of euphoria and dread. Cain 1 was no longer just an experiment. He had become something more, something they couldn't control. Alan felt the tension rising within his team. What had happened to Cain 1? Was he still around? And more importantly, how many more like him could there have been? The discovery of the library revealed a new dimension to the mission, turning it into a race against time and the unknown. The discovery of the hidden library left Alan and his team paralyzed for a moment, but they knew they had to keep going. There was one specific file that made them uneasy, titled Gene Fusion Experiments Final Report. The document described a series of brutal tests that went beyond imagination, crossing the boundaries of ethics and science. As Alan read, his understanding of the horrors carried out there deepened. Nazi scientists obsessed with creating super soldiers had begun incorporating animal genes into humans. The aim was to give soldiers abilities beyond natural human capabilities. Among the most disturbing experiments was the insertion of salamander genes into subjects to promote the regeneration of lost limbs. There were records of soldiers who had their arms amputated, and under extreme conditions, the limbs regenerated slowly, but in a deformed way. Another series of experiments attempted to use bat genes, hoping to confer immunity to disease, given bats' known resistance to many pathogens. Reports showed that in many cases, soldiers developed horrific deformities, while others appeared to gain resistance to fatal poisons and diseases. However, the application of these results was so grotesque that scientists themselves questioned the limits of experimentation. One of the most detailed reports described testing bear genes. The goal was to create soldiers who could hibernate for long periods in extreme environments, preserving their energy for later combat. However, the experiments resulted in violent side effects. The subjects who survived the process developed superhuman physical strength, but in return, they lost their sanity, transforming into violent and uncontrollable beasts. The room was silent as Alan processed this information. It was a science that should never have been explored, a twisted attempt to play God with human life. There were records of several of these successes, frozen in cryogenics for decades, preserved in ice, waiting to be awakened. Alan knew that if any of these soldiers survived, they would be an unstoppable threat. But there was an unsettling question hanging in the air. Where were these experiments now? Some of them could still be alive, trapped in the base's icy tunnels, or worse, lurking somewhere closer than they imagined. The days dragged on at the base, and the atmosphere among the team was tense, almost unbearable. Knowledge of the bizarre experiments placed constant psychological pressure on everyone. However, the true terror was just beginning to reveal itself. That afternoon, Alan and his team found what would be the most grotesque place on the base so far, the room known as the Games Room. The irony of the name was bitter. Upon opening the heavy, rusty door, they found themselves in a large, dark chamber filled with torture instruments and macabre devices. Alan and his team lay still, the shock hitting them like a wave. It was evident that this room had not just been used for scientific experimentation. She was an arena of suffering. Rusty hooks hung from the ceiling, and ancient torture machines with chains and pulleys suggested that human bodies had been stretched and torn there. Upon investigating more closely, they discovered that the games hall was the place where genetically modified soldiers were subjected to extreme endurance tests. There were metal chairs reinforced with belts, used to restrain the subjects while they were electrocuted and subjected to extreme temperatures, both heat and intense cold. Rotation machines forced the human body to unimaginable limits of physical and psychological resistance. On the walls there were claw marks and blood, evidence that the subjects at some point fought against the torture they suffered. It was clear that scientists weren't just creating super soldiers, they were testing the limits of the human body and mind, pushing these genetically altered soldiers to endure unimaginable pain. In the center of the room there was a bizarre throne, made of twisted metal and cold steel, where, according to records, the most dangerous experiment of all had been tested. Cain 1, the soldier who, in addition to surviving all the physical torture, developed psychic abilities, something that scientists had not predicted but which they now knew was an uncontrollable threat. It was there, in that macabre hall, that Alan began to understand the true extent of the terror. Cain 1 had transformed into something far more than a soldier. He was an entity, a force that could not be stopped. The scars on the steel of the throne were testimony to his fury. And now, knowing that he had escaped the base, Alan and his team found themselves facing an enemy that not even the ice of Antarctica could contain. The mood inside the base had changed. Fear settled in like a shadow, swallowing everyone's rationality. Each discovery seemed more sinister than the last, but what Alan and his team found next would leave a deep impression on them. After leaving the torture room, they came across another compartment, protected by sturdy locks and warning markings in German. It was a sector that did not appear on any of the maps found until then. When they managed to open the heavy door, the air inside was dry and freezing, and the metallic smell of blood permeated the room. The room was known to the Nazis as the Stable, and upon entering, Alan felt a wave of repulsion. In meticulously organized rows were glass capsules containing human remains, fetuses. All of them grotesquely deformed in appearance, the result of experiments that defied nature. The fogged glass barely hid the horror of each being that was formed there. Human parts mixed with animal characteristics, exaggeratedly large eyes, elongated limbs, and organs exposed in unnatural ways. Hallen approached a specific capsule, where a fetus seemed more developed. There was a sign identifying the subject, Subject X27, genetic mix, human and bear. The sight of the horribly deformed fetus sickened him, but what disturbed him most were the reports next to the incubators. The notes described an inhumane experiment that involved inseminating female prisoners with genetically modified sperm, taken from altered soldiers, and monitoring the development of these aberrations in special incubators. The records detailed how scientists removed fetuses from their mothers' bodies after 6 months of gestation and transferred them to these capsules, where they continued to grow in a controlled environment. The ultimate purpose? Create a new generation of soldiers with capabilities beyond those of humans, beings that would combine the ferocity of an animal with the intelligence and strength of a super soldier. But the horror didn't stop there. The team discovered that many of the fetuses were still developing when the base was abandoned, frozen in time, preserved in ice. There was something incredibly disturbing about the way these experiments were left unfinished. Helen could barely imagine what would have happened if these beings had been born, but the feeling that something was still alive inside those capsules haunted him. Helen knew he was in unfamiliar territory. Discoveries inside the Nazi base made each step more dangerous, but none of them were prepared for what came next. During a routine patrol through the underground corridors, one of the team's soldiers, Harrison, began complaining of a strange sensation, as if something was following him through the shadows. The tension was palpable, and Alan, with his keen military instincts, knew something wasn't right. That night, while the team slept in one of the temporary areas set up at the base, strange sounds echoed through the tunnels. Alan was the first to wake up, his senses on alert. Something was moving outside in the dark hallways, something that seemed not human. The steps were quick, almost stealthy, as if he was watching and waiting for the right moment to attack. Suddenly, an explosion of screams. Harrison had disappeared, his bed was empty, and the only thing left was a stain of blood on the floor. The team panicked, running through the hallways in search of their missing teammate. What they found, however, was far worse than anyone could have imagined. At the end of a tunnel, Harrison was standing, but something was wrong. His body was covered in deep wounds, as if something had torn away chunks of his flesh. He was babbling incoherently, his eyes glassy in absolute terror. "It's here. It's watching us," he repeated like a mantra. Before they could understand what had happened, Harrison collapsed to the ground, dead. The team, now terrified, began to realize the gravity of the situation. There was something alive inside the base, something that was not human but an aberration born of Nazi experiments. Hallen, struggling to maintain control, rallied the team and ordered a retreat to the surface. But communications to the outside had been mysteriously cut. They were trapped, with a deadly threat lurking. Harrison's disappearance and death was the first clear sign that the experiments carried out at the base had not been completely eradicated. The shadow of Cain 1, the super soldier with psychic abilities, loomed over everyone. Alan knew they didn't have much time. Whatever was deep within the base had woken up and was on the hunt. The name Cain 1 hung like a curse in the cold corridors of the base. The heavy silence among team members following Harrison's horrific death was a reflection of growing fear. Each knew, even without verbalizing it, that they were dealing with something beyond human control. An entity born of grotesque experiments and with unimaginable capabilities. Information about Cain 1 was scarce, scattered in fragments of files found in the hidden library and in whispers in scientists' records. For what they did know was enough to give you chills. Cain 1 wasn't just a genetically enhanced soldier, he was a freak created to be the ultimate weapon. Reports described Cain 1 as the sole survivor of a series of deadly experiments. Unlike the other test subjects who succumbed to attempts at genetic fusion with animals, Cain 1 had survived all the modifications. His physical strength was extraordinary, but what terrified scientists was the unexpected development of psychic and telekinetic abilities. Intensive testing had revealed that he could manipulate objects and even kill with the strength of his mind. In older reports, scientists detailed how Cain 1 began showing signs of mind control over his guards, and eventually, his creators. He was able to incite chaos and death on the base, and in his escape, wiped out many of those who tried to contain him. As time passed, his abilities became increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Even the most skeptical among Nazi scientists began to see in him a threat that needed to be eliminated at any cost. However, all attempts failed. Helen knew that Cain-1 was somewhere, perhaps still wandering the tunnels or worse, watching them closely. Fear took over every team decision. They were dealing with a creature who was not only physically invincible, but who could play with their minds, infiltrating their deepest thoughts and fears. Harrison's disappearance was just the beginning. The most terrifying thing was that Cain-1 wasn't attacking like a mindless beast. He was playing with them, testing their weaknesses, and the next move would be devastating. The revelations about Cain-1 seemed to only scratch the surface of something much darker. As Alan and his team tried to process what they had discovered, a new wave of panic washed over them. Cain-1's behavior, as described in the old reports, was cold. Calculating, he didn't attack impulsively. He observed, chose the right moment, and then destroyed. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, and Alan knew they were running out of time. While searching the library's remaining archives, they found an account of a final attempt at containment by the Nazis. When Cain-1 proved uncontrollable, scientists attempted to exterminate it using lethal gas in an emergency operation that had disastrous consequences. However, Cain-1 not only survived exposure to the gas, but also used it as a distraction to escape the base. The notes detailed the chaos that ensued, with scientists and guards being murdered in horrific ways, many of them never understanding what hit them. Alan could almost feel the desperation in the scientists' words, as if they already knew they were dealing with something beyond human understanding. The most terrifying part of the discovery came in a brief and almost forgotten note in the footnotes of the documents. Cain-1 escaped into the underground tunnels that stretch across the entire Antarctica. These tunnels, which the team thought were merely ancient infrastructure, were in fact a complex escape route. No one knew for sure where they ended up, but the suspicion was that Cain-1 used them to move across the unexplored ice, far from the main base, perhaps even surviving to this day, waiting patiently. For Alan, this confirmed his worst suspicions. Cain-1 wasn't just waiting, he was preparing. The base, abandoned for decades, was just the starting point of something much bigger. As the team discussed the best way to exit the base, Alan knew that the real problem wasn't just escaping, it was about making sure Cain-1 didn't leave too. The isolation of Antarctica, which once seemed to be their only protection, was now a prison. Severed communication, disappearances, and now the revelation that Cain-1 could still be out there, have made every decision a matter of life and death. The base wasn't just a relic of a dark past. She was the stage for something much more terrible about to be unleashed. With the revelations about Cain-1 still fresh in their minds, Alan and his team felt that the Antarctic ice held even deeper and more disturbing secrets. It wasn't just about the grotesque experiments carried out during World War II. There was something much more comprehensive. They began to realize that the Valkyrie project was not simply a desperate attempt by the Nazis to turn the tide during the war. It was part of an ongoing conspiracy that lasted long beyond the end of the conflict. On one of the last forays into the tunnels, the team found an area that had not been mentioned on any of the previous maps or documents. It was a secondary bunker, protected by reinforced doors and a series of security codes. Inside, they discovered an intact conference room with large wooden tables and chairs, as if it had been recently used. In the closets, they found files dating from much later than the end of the Second World War. Some dated back to the mid-70s and 80s. These files detailed that after the fall of the Third Reich, many of the scientists responsible for experiments on super soldiers continued their research in secret. The conspiracy involved not only Nazi remnants, but also governments and corporations who saw the potential in these experiments to create biological weapons and super soldiers that could be used in the Cold Wars and future conflicts. Among the names mentioned in the documents was that of Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death who would have supervised the most brutal experiments. Although Mengele was believed to have died in South America, the documents suggested that he continued his research for decades after the war, with the support of a secret network of collaborators. He was directly involved with the development of soldiers like Cain-1, and the file revealed that his experiments were never truly stopped. Alan was shocked to realize the magnitude of the conspiracy. The Antarctic base was not just a relic of Nazi history. It was an active laboratory, a testing ground for genetic manipulation research that had continued for decades under the world's radar. The super soldiers the Nazis tried to create were just the beginning of a bigger plan, an invisible weapon that continued to evolve, and Alan was beginning to realize that the team was involved in something much bigger than they could control. The weight of the discoveries and the constant feeling of being watched began to affect each member of the team. With the revelations about Cain 1 and the Nazi conspiracy still echoing in their minds, the tension reached boiling point. Any hope that they could simply escape the base quickly disappeared. Communication with the outside world was still cut off, and the feeling of being trapped in a death trap was palpable. That night, the first casualty occurred. The team had decided to split into small groups to continue exploring the base and look for an escape route. Carter, one of the engineers, was tasked with investigating an area of tunnels that appeared to lead to an ancient ventilation system. He wasn't particularly nervous, or at least he pretended not to be. With communications equipment clipped to his belt and flashlight in hand, he walked cautiously through the icy corridors, muttering to himself. Then Carter's radio went dead. There was no sound of struggle or alarm, just silence. Helen, who was in the makeshift command center, desperately tried to radio Carter, but there was no response. He and 2 other team members ran through the tunnels to find him. The hallway where Carter stood appeared intact, except for one frightening detail. Carter's flashlight was on the floor, still on, its beam cutting through the dark like a watchful eye. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood or clues as to where he had gone. As he continued down the corridor, Alan noticed something strange on the walls, deep claw marks, as if something huge and with extraordinary strength had passed through there. The markings vaguely resembled those found in the torture room, suggesting that Cain 1, or something equally deadly, was much closer than they imagined. As Alan and his team searched the area, it became clear that Carter had not simply disappeared. Something had taken him. Something silent, fast, and deadly. It was the first official casualty, and it shook everyone deeply. If Carter, one of the most prepared and rational members of the team, could disappear without a trace, then no one was safe. The base was no longer just a place of ancient secrets. Now it was alive, acting like an entity, a prison where something dark hunted one by one. Alan knew that more deaths would come, and that with each casualty, the chance of survival decreased. Carter's disappearance left the team in a state of absolute panic. Alan tried to maintain control of the situation, but he knew they were running out of time. Communication still cut off. The intense cold and the growing feeling that they were being hunted made each decision more critical. They were trapped. With no other option, Alan decided that they needed to return to the deepest area of the base, where the tunnels converged, in hopes of finding an exit through the ventilation systems or some emergency route that could have been used during Cain 1's escape. As they progressed through the hallways, the air seemed thicker, almost as if something was controlling the atmosphere. Alan knew that Cain 1 was there, somewhere, waiting for them. The silence was oppressive, and each step echoed like an omen of death. Suddenly, a deafening boom reverberated through the tunnel walls. The lights of their flashlights flickered, and a huge shadow ran in front of the group. Alan froze. The moment he feared had arrived. Cain 1 was there in front of them. His figure was colossal, deformed by the decades of experiments and the superhuman abilities he had developed. His eyes shone in the dark, injected with indescribable intelligence and malice. He was no longer a man. He was a creature of pure hatred and strength. Terror gripped the team, and before anyone could react, Cain 1 launched himself at them. The first to fall was Rourke, one of the soldiers. He was lifted from the ground by an invisible force, as if Cain 1's hands had grabbed him by the neck from a distance. Within seconds, his body was thrown violently against the wall, leaving only a trail of blood on the ice. Chaos ensued. The shots fired by the team were useless against something they could barely see or understand. Cain 1 moved with frightening speed and power, toying with the team like a predator savoring its prey. Helen knew that facing him would be suicide. "We must retreat now," he shouted, trying to organize a desperate retreat. As they ran through the tunnels, he could feel the weight of Cain 1's presence, his psychic force pressing down on their minds, causing pain and confusion. One by one, team members succumbed. Helen kept running, feeling the darkness behind him, knowing that at any moment he would be next. But something unexpected happened. In the middle of the chase, Cain 1 himself seemed to stop. As if something was stopping him from moving forward, the tunnel began to shake, and Alan realized that they were approaching a chamber that had not been explored, a room that contained the last secret of that cursed base. Alan and the few surviving members of the team rushed into the chamber. It was vast and circular, with ancient control panels and screens that flickered dimly with unreadable data. In the center of the room there was a huge capsule, covered in ice. With red lights flashing around it, Alan approached cautiously, and, to his horror, recognized the Nazi emblem engraved on the side of the capsule. Inside it was something that surpassed even Cain 1. A humanoid being, even more macabre, floated in a viscous liquid, preserved over the decades, waiting for the right moment to be released. Alan understood that Project Valkyrie had not just created a super soldier. They had created something much greater, a biological weapon capable of extinguishing humanity if released. And Cain 1, with all his power and ferocity, had been programmed to protect that last experiment. Suddenly the capsule began to emit an alarming sound, a growing hum that indicated the being inside was awakening. Alan knew they needed to get out of there immediately. "Run!" he shouted, knowing time was running out. With all the strength they had left, they ran through the tunnels, hearing the sound of ancient machines turning on behind them. Kais 1 was no longer behind them. His mission had changed. He now protected what was to come. When they finally reached the surface, the biting cold of Antarctica had never felt so welcoming. They had escaped, but what Alan knew now would haunt them forever. The secret base in Antarctica wasn't just a Nazi experiment. It was the birthplace of something much worse. Something that could still threaten the world if it were discovered. As the helicopter finally rescued them, Alan looked back at the silent white expanse of Antarctica, knowing that the secrets of that base would remain buried, at least for now. This was the terrifying and mystery-filled story about the secret base in Antarctica and the deadly experiments of Project Valkyrie, Cain 1, the super soldier with psychic abilities, and the secrets hidden in the ice are a dark reminder of how far science can go in the name of war and power. If you like this story full of suspense and twists, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this, and leave your like. This way you help bring more fascinating and terrifying stories. Until next time.